Oral questions by members.
Leader of the Official Opposition.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I want to recognize the Premier and my colleagues for the powerful words delivered in this legislature today. It sets the stage for the work that all of us need to do. Everyone in this legislature wants to know what we can do together, listening to First Nations leaders to support families and Indigenous people in our province. I'm sure the Premier has had the opportunity to speak to First Nations leaders over the weekend, and I would ask him today to outline for British Columbians how he plans to continue discussions with First Nations leaders and what they have said to him about possible next steps that can be taken to honor the lives of these children and support their families.
Premier.
Thank you, Honourable Speaker, and I thank all members of this House for the solemnity with which we are addressing these issues following on the revelations from Kamloops from last week. And the Leader of the Opposition is absolutely correct. There is more we can do. Our friend from Saanich North and the Islands inventoried a host of issues that we could address right away. And let me say, again, for our part, this side of the House, in the first mandate letters that we issued in 2017 when we came into government, focused specifically on the calls to action within provincial jurisdiction that were laid out in the Truth and Reconciliation Commission from 2015. And so my ministers have been diligently working on that, as they did, and as all of us did, when we unanimously supported the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. Another massive step forward, but again, not, as my colleague from Saanich North and the Islands will remind us, as will my friend from Skeena and the member for Mount Pleasant. Words are fine. Words are fine, but what impact are we going to have on the families that have been affected by this? And it's not, and with great respect, I don't mean to diminish in any way the extraordinary work of the Tk'emlúps and Secwépemc peoples here, but because they are now the epicenter of a national tragedy. And the power of their ability to bring people together is so critically important. And I know that my two friends from the region and the Solicitor General and others will be working to make sure that everything that we can do to get to the bottom of how this could have happened. As my colleague from Saanich North said, this was not a surprise because it's been talked about not just in Kamloops, but in Lower Post, on Cooper Island, and in other places across British Columbia and around the country. This is a cathartic moment and a moment that we should all seize so that we can do everything in our power to relieve the pressure, relieve the strain. And I think it would start by ensuring that our K-12 system does a comprehensive job of telling the story of Canada, not with rose-colored glasses, but with the reality with which it deserves.
Leader of the Official Opposition, supplemental.
Thank you, Honourable Speaker. Well, I want to thank the Premier for his answer. We all know that the damage is not confined to one community, but it invokes a devastating part of our national history. Right across British Columbia and our country, families are feeling devastation, anger, and hurt. We know that there is a national crisis line and that British Columbia has a First Nations and Indigenous crisis line in place. But again, I would hope the Premier could share with us what additional resources are in place or could be immediately put in place to provide direct support to First Nations people as they grapple with their grief, their loss, and all of us face the likelihood that many more difficult days lie ahead.
Premier.
Thank you, Honourable Speaker, and again, I thank the member for her question. And she's absolutely right, through you, Honourable Speaker, that we need to look at the next weeks and months and indeed years and recommit to British Columbia, the true story of who we are, how we got here, and where we collectively want to go together. When we unanimously passed the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People by bringing in DRIPA in this institution, we sent a message to the world that we are going to turn history upside down, return resources to peoples who have been on this land for millennia. We've been working through the treaty process. We've been working through reconciliation agreements. We've been trying to build capacity on a whole host of issues. The member will know this full well from her extensive period in Executive Council, that governments have been trying for some time to get ahead of these issues, but we have universally failed. Broad steps, bold actions, but does that impact people on the ground? Does that impact those survivors who are living today with Chief Harvey from the Upper Nicola Band, who I've met several times, to hear him say in the public press how this was bringing it all back to him again. Friends that had just thought had gone home, that didn't go home. These are powerful, powerful feelings that we are having. Imagine what's happening in Indigenous communities across this country right now. We have an obligation to release resources where we can to improve people's lives, and we're committed to doing that. And I know that the member opposite will hold us accountable for that, and I look forward to it.
Member for Skeena.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and to the Premier and the other leaders in here that spoke about the events unfolding in Kamloops. Thank you for your words. And with all due respect, now is not the time to talk about UNDRIP or mandate letters from 4 years ago. It's not time for a stump speech. This tragedy is affecting Canadians, Aboriginal and non-Aboriginal alike. People are crying. Put aside the politics for a second. Everybody. The confirmation of unmarked grave of 215 children has revived memories for many First Nations people. It confirms what many survivors from all over BC, from 203 bands in BC, have long said. There is a multitude of children who never made it home. For most of the history of these schools, the practice was not to send the bodies of students who died at schools to their home communities. My question, can the Premier tell us, tell the province, tell the people of British Columbia, Aboriginal, non-Aboriginal alike, specifically, what will this government be doing to work with the 203 First Nation communities in BC to repatriate these children?
Premier.
Thank you, Honourable Speaker. And as I said in response to an earlier question, we're working with the Secwépemc and the Tk'emlúps to try and work with them to get to a place where we can share this information and actually return people to their traditional territories. And I appreciate the passion with which the member brings these questions. I was not bringing politics in at any time, and I know he wasn't either. This is a moment for British Columbia to understand and fully absorb the magnitude of the stain of residential schools on all of our history. But most importantly, as my friend from North Saanich said, this is an opportunity to try at some modest way to feel the pain and anguish that exists in Indigenous communities right across this province, right across this country. That's what we can hope to bring from this if we are non-Indigenous. But as representatives in this place, collectively, we shall work with the bands in Kamloops and others across this province to bring true reconciliation, to bring all of the calls to action, which were put together not by us, but by the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. Make sure that those calls to action are real, substantive, and have an impact on people's lives. That's the commitment I can make, and again, I know the member will hold me to that.
Member for Skeena, supplemental.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And correction, this is not my passion. This is my life. My parents, uncles, aunts, friends, acquaintances from other communities, from 203 communities in BC. This is not just a Kamloops issue. Children from all over BC, from every single community, were sent to residential schools all across BC and Canada. This is not just the burden of the Kamloops people. They are to be commended for bringing this to light, for what we always were suspicious about, based on the stories of people like my parents. And I look forward to everyone in this chamber taking the time to listen and act accordingly. Because I do agree that the time for action is long past. It's long past. I uncovered this in 2004. Everybody, at some point in their life, heard a story about this. The time for action is now. While the whole world is shocked. While Canadians want to know what's next. And so for those who survived residential schools, for their families and friends who had to listen to the stories of the survivors, and of course for the voices of the children that we will never hear. For the Premier, I hope he agrees, as I hope everybody in this House agrees, that we must do everything we can to return these children to their homes.
Premier.
Speaker, and I very much thank the member for Skeena for his question and the way he presented it. I will commit to this House that working with the Secwepemc and the Kamloops, whatever steps we can take, whatever resources need be brought to bear, working with Indigenous nations across this province to see what we could do to bring all these things together. As I said, the minister and I will be in Lower Post. It will be a powerful moment for those northern nations, and I suspect that there will be nations as well who will be bringing the call in the days and weeks ahead to build out the plan that the member is seeking for us to deliver today. It's not there, it will be, and with his help and with the help of other members of this House, I'm confident that we can bring together a plan that all of us can be proud of as a modest step to address the challenges that have been in place long before many of us came to this House. Certainly, that does not relieve our obligation to do everything we can going forward to make sure that we can do redress appropriately, and that's what we will do.
Member for Saanich North and Islands.
I came equipped today with a different question about a different subject, but my hope is that this can be the response to these stories over the weekend can be not just a response from the ministers, but also a response from this Legislative Assembly. And we have the ability to do that. Mr. Speaker, over the past few weeks, the world's attention has become focused on Fairy Creek because thousands of British Columbians are showing up to protest this provincial government's lack of protection of these rare and endangered ecosystems. 2 weeks ago, I raised the Auditor General's report saying BC is not doing enough to follow its own policy on conservation. Just after that, I highlighted the mapping that a trio of scientists have done showing where the most endangered old forests are and where it needs to be immediately deferred from cutting. Today, I'd like to add that there's a significant amount of federal money on the table, money that BC could use to conserve these forests and support communities through transition. The federal government has put $2.3 billion on the table to expand protected areas, and that could be a game changer, Mr. Speaker, if the NDP chooses to take it. Through you to government, my question is to the Minister of Forests. Will she commit to using every federal dollar that is on the table to protect these endangered old forests and to stop the battles playing out on the ground today?
Premier.
Thank you, Honourable Speaker, and I thank the member for his question. And it's very true. He knows full well that I'm intimate with the area, Fairy Creek and environs. It's my home community. I know it intimately. I also know the Pachidat, and I also know the Huayat, and I know the Dididat, and it is their territory. We've talked about this in this legislature. At this time, more than ever, we need to acknowledge their rights and title to that territory and sovereignty, in my opinion, over those lands. Having said that, and I got a movement from the member, and I look forward to perhaps a discussion either in here or offline about that, but specifically to the question about federal resources, I too have been hearing of promises of federal resources. I've been asking about those federal resources, and I'm hopeful that they will turn up. But I've heard of federal resources in the past as well, and they have not shown up. I do understand that there are opportunities here. We have been pursuing that in government-to-government discussions through my Intergovernmental Relations Secretariat, as well as in direct conversations with federal officials.
Member for Sandwich Northern Ireland, supplemental.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Speaker, and appreciate the Premier highlighting the complexity of the situation that we have in these particular areas. Although I think that it's fair to say that the response of British Columbians, the response of people on southern Vancouver Island to Fairy Creek or to specific locations is actually a response about the protection of these last remaining ecosystems, these last remaining endangered ecosystems, the protection of old growth. And, you know, the federal government put $2.3 billion in their budget, and it may or may not be there and may or may not be available immediately. But in the recent BC budget, there wasn't anything, no money. So it's in the federal budget. It's nowhere to be found in the provincial budget. No money to implement the recommendations of the Old Growth Review Panel that the Premier promised to implement fully, all recommendations, in the last election. TJ Watt from the Ancient Forest Alliance says because the federal investment, the BC NDP has been handed the keys to ensure that much of the grandest, most endangered old growth forests can be protected. The federal government is going to have the money on the table. Is the BC government going to chase that money down? Again, my question is to the Minister of Forests. What specific actions is she taking to find out if that money is available? And if not, go to the Treasury Board to ensure that there's money that British Columbia is putting on the table to follow through on the commitments that the BC NDP government made British Columbians in the 2020 election to implement all of the recommendations, specifically recommendation number 6 as a first step to defer these sensitive ecosystems.
Premier.
Thank you, Honourable Speaker. And my colleague will know that it was this government that appointed the Old Growth Commission. And we were happy to receive the report, and in fact so happy that we said we would embrace all of the recommendations and implement them. The member will know that there were significant deferrals, some 200,000 hectares, immediately because there had been discussions with Indigenous nations about that, and approval and in fact requests were made to do so. On the other areas, like Fairy Creek, that discussion had yet to take place and is ongoing. I appreciate the member's passion. I am passionate about old trees, and this will come as no surprise to anyone who knows me, no surprise whatsoever. But there are complex issues. The member understands that. I know members from the official opposition understand that. If we're going to make a seismic change in how forestry is done, we need to have buy-in from everyone. That's why tomorrow the Minister of Forests and I will be issuing an intentions paper that will lay out not just how we will address old growth, but how we will address forestry across the province. The time is now to take action when the public's attention to these issues is at its highest. There have been times in our history when forestry has been neglected and forgotten. It is certainly not being neglected and forgotten today. That is a good thing in my mind. We need to take the opportunity that this moment in time presents to us, a very capable report lauded by all those who've had the opportunity to read it, and a government's committed to implementing it. I think the stars are aligning. We're going to have good news tomorrow on the intentions paper and more good news about old growth logging on Vancouver Island later this summer.
Member for Surrey South.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. This is National Accessibility Week, as we heard earlier, and the Minister has also proclaimed this week Accessibility Week here in British Columbia. This year's theme is Leaving No One Behind. We've seen the work that's been done and is being done in British Columbia on accessibility, and we know there's much more to do. To the Premier, how is the government supporting research and innovation, like spinal cord research, that helps people with significant disabilities lead healthier, more active lives in our communities?
Minister of Social Development and Poverty Reduction.
Thank you very much. Let me just begin by saying to everyone that I hope that they have an opportunity to participate in Accessibility Week, National Accessibility Week, which is obviously trumpeted across the country, and in particular in British Columbia, as we become more aware of the accessibility issues and the barriers that we need to remove in order for everyone to be able to live the most inclusive life in British Columbian society. And I want to just thank the member for Surrey South in particular for her advocacy in this role for many years, and I just want to recognize her work. when it comes to specific issues around investments in research, I would suggest that my ministry doesn't engage in that particular type of activity, but so I would direct her question elsewhere, but I'm pleased that she's recognizing and recognizes the importance of all British Columbians to pay attention to Accessibility Week this year.
Member for Surrey South supplemental.
I'll thank the minister for his kind words, but appreciate if he doesn't have the answers, perhaps he should not be the one taking the questions. The Premier should be aware that the Praxis Spinal Cord Institute's a global leader in research on all things spinal cord injuries, including treatments for pressure sores. They are based in Vancouver. The organization has had its base operational funding of $3.3 million a year provided by the BC government since it was founded in 2010. Their funding renewal request has been with government for the past year, but 2 months into this new fiscal year, Praxis has not heard if their funding will be renewed. The funding was not renewed as of March 31st. Will the Premier reinstate this funding for spinal cord research today?
Premier.
The member will know that she and I actually met when neither one of us were in this House. We were working with Rick Hansen to raise awareness of spinal cord injury and to bring forward fundraising opportunities for the very research that she's talking about. So I know certainly her focus on this. I know that's a passion of mine as well, and I'll go back, and I apologize for pushing it to Nick. It was, pardon me, to the minister responsible, but I interpreted it to be a question on accessibility, not on research. As a budget question, I will go back and talk to the Minister of Finance and the Ministry of Health, where I believe the dollars initially come from, and see where we can get to, and I'll come back to the minister directly on, or the member directly on that question.
Member for Peace River North.
Thank you, Honourable Speaker. Just to follow up on my colleague's question, Praxis has not heard anything from the government about the fate of their funding. Funding has been provided to this organization since 2010 and needs to be renewed this year, or should have already been renewed. The future of this organization is at risk. It includes 50 highly skilled research jobs. It has no other source of operating funds. So in honor of National Accessibility Week, will the Premier be able to commit today to give Praxis the funding that they do need to survive?
Premier.
Thank you. I thank the member for the question. And as I said to his colleague, I will go back to the Minister of Finance, Minister of Health, find out the status of the funding, and I'll get back to the member for Surrey South. I'm sure she'll pass it on to you.
Member for Peace River North supplemental.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Thank you, Premier. There are 6,000 people that live in BC with spinal cord injuries. In fact, hundreds of people each year get a catastrophic injury like this. These injuries cost over $370 million each year. So I guess to follow up on my previous question regarding getting us the answers that we're looking for, will the Premier also, while he's having that conversation, direct his minister to immediately work with Praxis and to ensure that they receive long-term sustainable funding that they need to carry on their work?
Premier.
Thank you, Honourable Speaker. And as I said to the member and the one previous, I'll go back, discuss this with ministers and staff, and get an answer to the opposition as quickly as I can.
Member for Kamloops South Thompson.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Recently, the Premier created in BC a $500 million high-risk venture capital scheme using public funds. The Office of the Information and Privacy Commissioner sent a very strongly worded letter to the government calling out its plans to shroud this high-risk investment fund in secrecy by a number of things, not subjecting BC to the province's FOI legislation. But when we asked the Premier about it the other week, the Premier hadn't even read the letter. So the question is this: has the Premier now read the letter, and will he listen to the Information and Privacy Commission and subject his high-risk venture capital scheme to FOI?
Minister of Jobs, Economic Recovery and Innovation.
Thank you, Honourable Speaker, and thank you to the member for the question. As the member knows, we canvassed this in great length during the third reading, that similar to the previous government, when they created the BC Immigrant Investment Fund, they chose not to put it under FOI rules at that time. I suspect they did that because they heard similar concerns from the private sector about sensitive commercial information and how that would be handled and made public. That being said, the letter has been received. We are engaging with those in the private sector, those in the investment community to assess what the views are, and we'll have more information once those consultations are done.
Member for Kamloops South Thompson, supplemental.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Well, this is a premier who promised a transparent government, who is now asking to spend $500 million on a high-risk venture capital scheme. No public access to the business plan for NBC, no public access to impact scorecards on each investment, and no subjecting NBC to Freedom of Information legislation in British Columbia. The Information and Privacy Commissioner has been very clear in his letter that the government's excuses cannot be justified. The letter points out that the BC Investment Management Corporation is far larger and is subject to FOI. So the question again to the Premier is this: why is the Premier ignoring the clear demands of the Information and Privacy Commissioner to subject his government's high-risk venture capital scheme to FOI?
Minister of Jobs and Economic Recovery.
Thanks, Honourable Speaker. And again, I think is a little rich from this member giving lessons on FOIs to anyone, but that will take his question on notice, as I've already shared with them multiple times, that we have taken advice from those in the private sector. They've said that there were some concerns. We've seen the letter that's been received just recently from the independent office. We're going to continue to consult with them, and also consult with the private sector to ensure that all the issues that they may have been addressed, and we'll have more information on that in a timely future.
Opposition House Leader.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Well, the letter for the Privacy Commissioner came out before the legislation was finished in this House. The Citizen Services Minister was questioned on this in estimates while that bill was still in front of this House. And the Premier was asked about this several weeks ago. It's not that complicated of a concept. The Conflict of Interest Commissioner makes it very clear in his letter that in BC, the $500 million investment scheme should be subject to freedom of information. And in fact, the Premier committed to looking at that letter and making a decision quickly. That was a few weeks ago. So again, to the Premier, is in BC, well, the Premier seems to think it was days ago. I remind the Premier we actually weren't in the legislature last week, so it's been a couple of weeks. Again, not a complicated ask by the Conflict of Interest Commissioner. Has the Premier made a decision on whether or not the NBC investment scheme will be subject to freedom of information?
Minister of Citizen Services.
Thank you, Honourable Speaker, and I want to thank the members for the question. The Minister of Jobs, Economic Development and Investment has been quite clear that transparency and accountability is going to be critical for this organization. And INBC's legislation requires those annual reports and its performance on these investments. And the ministers then has to table the reports to the Legislative Assembly and make the reports. Now, make those reports public. Now, the members are referring back to the Immigration Fund, and the Jobs Minister has made it very clear that this is a continuation of this fund and that we have put the appropriate measures in place. In fact, I have a letter here from 2010 from the previous Minister of Citizen Services that in fact outlines that to respect legal confidentiality, agreements in place with fund managers operating, and it goes on to say that the fund transparency is achieved through operational reporting under the BCIIF annual report. I'd also like to clarify that the source of the BCIFF's capital fund is not taxpayer funds, but rather sourced from immigrant investors through a federal program. The key there being, Honourable Speaker, is that public transparency is through the annual reporting. Now, this was a decision made by the previous Minister of Citizen Services when asked about the Immigration Fund. We are working with the Privacy Commissioner. The Jobs Minister is ensuring that the accountability and transparency is embedded in this fund through annual reporting, and we're going to continue on that good work.
Opposition House Leader.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Well, with respect to the Minister of Citizen Services, this isn't about 2010. This is about direction from the Conflict of Interest Commissioner in 2021. This is about the Conflict of Interest Commissioner saying that we should, or the Privacy Commissioner saying that we should have in BC $500 million investment scheme subject to FOI. In fact, the Minister of Citizen Services could make that regulatory change with a stroke of a pen. Doesn't need to rely on the Jobs Minister, doesn't even actually have to rely on the Premier to make that happen. So I guess the question to the Minister of Citizen Services is, has the Minister of Citizen Services, given that it's her responsibility to make sure there is freedom of information access on a wide range of issues, based on the letter from the Commissioner, it seemed that the Citizen Services Minister actually was wanting this to fall into freedom of information based on the wording in the letter. Did the Minister of Citizen Services advocate for NBC to be subject to FOI, or did she turn a blind eye to the request from the Commissioner?
Minister of Citizen Services.
Thank you, Honourable Speaker. And it's great. I have another letter from 2010 here from the previous Minister of Citizen Services that very clearly outlines, in response to the request of the Information and Privacy Commissioner of the time, that the process for adding new or existing entities begins with the ministry responsible submitting a request. And once the request is received, it would be included in the ministerial regulation for such purposes, and that it would be a broad overreach for the Minister of Citizen Services to go against the Jobs Ministry of the time. Now, again, to the members opposite, we've been consulting, the Minister of Jobs has been consulting with community. We have met with the Privacy Commissioner. We have ensured that all the transparency and accountability are in place. And I think it's just really important to actually restate what the previous Minister of Citizen Services said, that public transparency is achieved through operational reporting under the annual report. That is what we are doing, Honourable Speaker. Thank you.
The bell ends the question period.